Whenever an economy uses a system of fiat money, as like the US economy, some agency must be responsible for regulating the system. In the United States, this system is called Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the US. But the Fed is an example of a central bank. What is a central bank? Central bank is an institution designed to oversee the banking system and regulate the quantity of money in the economy. There are other major central banks around the world, including the Bank of England, Bank of Japan, and European Central Bank. What is monetary policy? It is the setting of the money supply by policymakers in the central bank. Let's start talk about the Fed structure. The Federal Reserve was created in 1930 after a series of bank failures in 1907. And then these bank failures convinced Congress that the United States needed a central bank to ensure the health of nation's banking system. Today, the Fed is run by its board of governors. Okay, there are 7 members appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The governors have 14 years of terms, just as federal judges are given lifetime appointments to insulate them from politics. Fed governors are given long term to give them independence from short-term political pressure when they formulate monetary policy. Among the 7 members of Board of Governors, the most important is the chairman. The chairman directs the Fed staff, presides over board meetings, and testifies regularly about Fed policy in front of congressional committees. The president appoints the chairman to a 4-year term. And then in January 2014, the Fed chairman is Janet Yellen, actually Fed chairwoman, and who is appointed by Barack Obama. The Federal Reserve System is made up of Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and 12 regional Federal Reserve banks located in major cities around the country. One of the central banks is in Dallas, Federal Reserve Bank. The presidents of the regional banks are chosen by each bank's board of directors, whose members are typically drawn from the region's banking and business community. The Fed has 2 related jobs. The first is to regulate banks and ensure the health of banking system. This task is largely the responsibility of the regional Federal Reserve banks. In particular, the Fed monitors each bank's financial condition and facilitates bank transactions by clearing checks. It also acts as a bank's bank, that is, Fed makes loans to banks when banks themselves want to borrow. When financially troubled banks find themselves short of cash, the Fed acts as a lender of last resort, a lender to those who cannot borrow anywhere else to maintain stability in the overall banking system. Okay, this was the first part of the job, but the most important and second job is to control the quantity of money that is made available in the economy, called the money supply. Decisions by policymakers concerning the money supply constitute monetary policy. At the Fed, monetary policy is made by Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, and the FOMC meets about every 6 weeks in Washington, D.C. to discuss the conditions of economy and consider the changes in the monetary policy. Let's more talk about Federal Open Market Committee. The FOMC is made up of the 7 members of the Board of Governors and 5 of 12 regional bank presidents. All 12 regional presidents attend each FOMC meeting, but only 5 get to vote. The 5 with voting rights rotate among the 12 regional presidents over time. The president of the New York Fed always gets a vote because New York is the traditional financial center of the US economy, and because all Fed purchases and sales of government bonds are conducted at the New York Fed's trading center desk. Through the decisions of the FOMC, the Fed has the power to increase or decrease the number of dollars in the economy. Okay, it may be tough to understand in the beginning how Fed is controlling the quantity of money, but in simple metaphorical terms, you can imagine the Fed printing dollar bills and dropping them around the country by helicopter. Similarly, you can imagine the Fed using a giant vacuum cleaner to suck dollar bills out of people's wallets. Although in practice the Fed's method for changing the money supply is more complex and subtle than this, the helicopter vacuum metaphor is a good first step to understand the meaning of monetary policy. And later in this chapter, we will discuss how the Fed actually changes the money supply, but it's worth noting here that the Fed's primary tool is open market operations, the purchase and sale of US government bonds, okay? If the FOMC decides to increase the money supply, the Fed creates dollars and uses them to buy government bonds from the public in nations' bond markets. And after the purchase, these dollars in the hands of the public. Thus, an open market purchase of bonds by the Fed increases the money supply. Conversely, if the FOMC decides to decrease the money supply, the Fed sells government bonds from its portfolio to the public in the nation's bond markets. And after the sale, the dollars the Fed receives for the bonds are out of the hands of the public. So, an open market sale of the bonds by the Fed decreases the money supply. Let me clarify this point because it's very important to understand how Fed controls the. Let's now think about Fed sells bonds. Fed sells bonds. So Fed is selling bonds to the public, and in return, public is paying dollars to the Fed. So what did Fed do? Fed actually vacuum all the dollars from the public's wallet. So selling bond is actually decreasing the quantity of money in the public, in the economy. How? By giving paper bonds to the people, but taking out their dollars. Second case is Fed I cannot delete this, but Fed now is going to not to sell bonds, but buy bonds. Now instead, the public is giving bonds to the to the Fed. Bonds are the papers. And return, Fed prints money and gives dollars to the public. So what happens? The public has dollars. In return, Fed has bonds. That means the quantity of money increase in the economy. Okay, that is how the system works. As you understand from this, for this reason, we need to understand Fed carefully because Fed's policy decisions are key determinants of the economy's main variables in the long run and even in the short run. So for that reason, we will talk about it again, Fed tools for monetary policy in the following slides. Before we start how banks create money, I want to talk about a couple of definitions. The first one is fractional reserve banking system. In fractional reserve banking system, banks keep a fraction of deposits as reserve and use the rest of it to make loans. So let me clarify what is reserve. Let's say you have $100 at your hand and you deposit this $100 into the bank. And the deposits that the bank have received but have not been loaned out are called reserves. So let's say the bank system gets $100, the bank gets $100 from you and give as loans $50. So the remaining $50 is not given or loan out is called as reserves. Here $50 will be the reserves for the bank. And the Fed establishes reserve requirements. What is reserve requirements? They are the regulations on the minimum amount of reserves that banks must hold against depositors. Reserve requirements is usually in terms of percentage. Let's say Fed establishes 10% reserve requirement. What does that mean? Every $100 that is deposited to the bank, banks can loan $90 out loan, and needs to keep $10 in the reserves. Okay, $10 in the reserves, $90 as loans. So as you see, 10% reserve requirement is established by the Fed. That is the minimum amount of reserve. The bank can keep more money in the reserves, but the minimum amount, the reserves, the banks must hold against the depositor. And banks may hold more than this minimum amount if they choose. The reserve ratio, R, is the fraction of deposits that banks hold as reserves. Here in this example, the reserve ratio is 10%. Reserve requirement is $10. Or reserve ratio is the total reserves as a percentage of total deposits. Okay. And let's continue on a couple of definitions. Every bank has a T account. What is a T account? Maybe you know it from your accounting classes. A simplified accounting statement that shows a bank's assets and liabilities. Okay, here is the T account for First National Bank. And in this example, there is a deposit amount of $100. On the left side of the T account are the bank's assets of reserves plus loans, which is reserves are $10 and loans are $90, total amount of $100. And on the right hand side, it is the deposits, which is the amount of $100. That liabilities is $100 is the amount that the bank owes to the depositor. Okay, that's why it's liabilities. Because the assets and liabilities exactly balance, this accounting statement is sometimes called a balance sheet. Okay. So here, if we want to understand what is the reserve, here reserve is the $10. That means the bank has to keep it in the bank's vault. And in this example, you will realize that the reserve requirement is $10 is the reserves. Total assets is 100, so 10 over 100 times 100 will give you 10%. So the bank has to keep 10% of its total reserve in the reserve of the bank's vault.